Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you today, but I must tell you that I haven't had a whole lot to do with cemeteries. As historian for Prince George's County, I will deal mostly with buildings, land, of course, families, individuals, events, and cemeteries have been sort of tangential. But as you know, they enter into everything. And so, since we have so many very interesting cemeteries and cemetery stories, Eileen asked me to give you something about some of the cemeteries of Prince George's County that have interesting stories. So I'm hoping you will find some of these interesting, and let's go through a few of them. First of all, this map, which is part of the 2010 Master Plan for Historic Preservation for Prince George's County, I put it up on a poster out in the lobby. Some of you may have been looking for it. It's on one of the tables, and it is not for sale. But if you want to look at it in detail, you could go over, check it out after we talk about these cemeteries. There are about 185 cemeteries, documented cemeteries indicated on this map throughout Prince George's County. I think we'll start with a place which probably is familiar to most of you. May I ask how many of you have been to Riverdale in Riverdale Park, Maryland? Not too many. Well, I could spend easily the rest of this hour, the next hour, telling you about Riverdale, which I will not do, I promise. But I do have to tell you that it was the house which was begun in 1801, 1802, in the area close to Bladensburg, near the district line with the District of Columbia, started by an aristocrat from Antwerp, now Belgium, who fled from his home in Antwerp, his several homes in Antwerp, in 1794, brought his family to the United States, and in 1801 began the development of a plantation on about 800 acres outside of the District of Columbia and near the town, already thriving town of Bladensburg. His daughter, whose portrait by Gilbert Stuart you see on the right, was the only one of that immediate family that stayed in the United States. Her parents and brother and sister returned to Antwerp in 1803, and she and her husband, whom you see on the left, George Calvert, a direct descendant of the Lords Baltimore, finished working on the house which we call Riverdale, and the development of the plantation, which grew to about 2,000 acres, and included the nucleus of what became the University of Maryland at College Park. Now, of course, there's a cemetery just about a quarter of a mile away from the mansion, as usual. And let's see if I can get this to move. There. And I wanted to show you this because the tomb of Rosalie, who died at age 43 after having produced 9 children, of whom 5 lived to adulthood. She died in March of 1821, and her husband, who survived another almost 20 years, hired one of Benjamin Henry Latrobe's Italian sculptors, whom Latrobe had brought here from Italy to help him with details in the Capitol building. So in 1821, George Calvert hired, what was his name? Giovanni Andre, to sculpt the tomb for his wife, Rosalie. I have a picture, and I apologize for its fuzziness. I couldn't get in a position to take a really decent picture of the end of her tomb, but you see there in the upper right, Rosalie ascending to heaven, the 4 babies, her 4 children who had predeceased her, extending their arms to her as she ascends to heaven. I'll just read you what her daughter wrote about this. In just about 6 months later, her oldest daughter, Caroline, wrote to her relatives in Antwerp, "My father has ordered a beautiful white marble tombstone, which is nearly finished." This was in July, only a few months after Rosalie died. On the head panel, he had executed by an Italian sculptor the figure in low relief of my mother ascending to heaven on a cloud, and a little higher, 4 angels, her children, are stretching out their arms to receive her into the celestial city. And then some years later, Jonathan Elliott, who wrote the historical sketches of 10 miles square forming the District of Columbia, wrote, "A few hundred yards northwest of the mansion, a piece of rising ground marks the burial spot of the manor house, where Mrs. Calvert's remains are deposited, within a white marble tomb and those of 4 infant children. Actually, the graves of the children are arranged at the head of the tomb, on which is carved by the masterly chisel of Andrei a resurrection piece representing the mother, preceded by the children, ascending to everlasting bliss. The principal figure is a good likeness of the original and a fine specimen of Italian sculpture." So we don't have too many of these pieces of art, of exceptional art in Prince George's County, but this is one of my favorites. And of course, if you have time, do visit Riversdale. It's a National Historic Landmark, and there are so many reasons that it's eligible to be a National Historic Landmark that if I started telling you about that, we'd be here all day. We're right near Bladensburg, and the Calverts, of course, used Bladensburg as their center. And there is an older cemetery in Bladensburg, which was started in as early as the 1720s. There was a group of Presbyterians, Scottish immigrants, who started a Presbyterian church in Upper Marlborough, which became the county seat. And in 1725, they started another Presbyterian church in Bladensburg. This is even before the town of Bladensburg really is organized and platted. There was a church there, a log church, which is long gone. But the cemetery started, and you're looking at the oldest surviving tombstone there to William Maudewit, who was buried there in 1749. The cemetery is maintained by the town of Bladensburg, and you have to get a key from the police to even go into the grounds. Next to it, in an area which is not maintained, there is, we believe, a cemetery for the African American folks of Bladensburg, but that awaits real work sometime in the future, which we really hope does happen. Let's go to just a few other plantations scattered around the very large extent of Prince George's County. This place you may know of also. It is now the Enterprise Golf Course, a very popular and beautiful place in the Mitchellville area, a sort of central north part of Prince George's County. On the left, you're seeing a mansion which has replaced the original plantation house. This was the tract called Warrington, belonging to the Waring family. That's W-A-R-I-N-G. Marsham Waring died in 1860, and his house was destroyed not too long after that. And then in the 20th century, the property, a large extent of property, was sold to Commander Newton White, who was the commander of the USS ship Enterprise, and he renamed his farm Enterprise and started a model dairy farm there. You get an idea of the dairy farm as we look out across the practice range of the golf course. And right near there is the Waring family graveyard, which the staff of the golf course takes good care of. So when you go to play golf there, you can make a small pilgrimage to the Waring family graveyard. Another plantation, and this again you may have heard of, this is the home of Prince George's County's only justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. His name was Gabriel Duvall. He was appointed to the court by Madison in 1812, and this house, Marietta, was built at just about that same time. Now, the Gabriel Duvall's family members were buried in a small graveyard on the property, on the Marietta property. Again, the traditional, just about a quarter of a mile away from the house. But back in the 1980s, that area was endangered by the construction of Maryland Route 193, or locally known as Glendale Boulevard, which comes right through there and would have a very devastating impact on the small graveyard. So archaeology was done, sponsored by the Park and Planning Commission, which now owns the Marietta House Museum, and the local historical society. And the remains and the gravestones were moved onto the immediate grounds of the Marietta House Museum. That parcel is about 25 acres. So the stones you see on the lower right, some are original and one is brand new. I think I have a close-up. Yes. We never have found the stone for Gabriel Duvall. We know he was buried in that family cemetery, but whether he ever, and we believe he had a stone, but it's no longer available. And so a new stone was made, and I put up a little piece of the article that announced the finding of Gabriel Duvall's horse, which was probably his favorite horse, named Royalty. And so this cemetery, unlike many others, does have not only the plantation proprietor, but his favorite horse. And this is on the immediate grounds now of the Marietta House Museum. If we do make it through the weather to the Bowie family graveyard this afternoon, we will go right past Marietta, and if any of you want to stop on the way back, I'd be glad to show you. Now we're going to go south and east, not too far from the Patuxent, to the little village called Croom, and the prettiest church in Prince George's County. Well known for that, but it has lots of other interesting things about it too. I am particularly interested in St. Thomas because at the moment, as Eileen mentioned, I'm working on a set of 3 Civil War diaries written by this gentleman, John William Burroughs. I have only 61, 62, and 63, so I don't know how the war ends, but he writes daily about life on his plantation. He was a member of the vestry of St. Thomas Croom, so he writes quite a bit about what's going on at the church. And I will tell you a little bit about that. It's a fascinating job. Here is the fenced area is the enclosure of the Burroughs family. Now, John William Burroughs is buried here. He died in 1884. But he has no stone, and probably never did. He lost his property after the war, and probably didn't have money to buy a stone, but he is there. His mother has a stone. The largest stone there is to Caroline Clarissa Burroughs, his mother, who died in June of 1862, and all the pages of his diary at that time are cut out. But shortly after that, he gets involved in the purchase of the railing for his enclosure. And I feel sure that hers was the first burial in their enclosure. In his diary, he writes, wait a minute, on October 4th, 1862, I went to Nottingham. Now that's a port town on the Patuxent River, the closest to Mr. Burroughs in Croom. Went to Nottingham to see if the vessel has come yet with the iron railing for the churchyard. It's not yet here. But he goes back on the 18th of October, sent teams down to Nottingham to bring up the iron railing for his enclosure, for our lot at the church. I went over to the church, and men were putting up the enclosure for John T. Barry. Now, John T. Barry was a neighbor of his in the Croom area who died approximately the same time as John Burroughs' mother, and the men in the graveyard, in the large and beautiful St. Thomas Church graveyard, were busy putting up the enclosure for Mr. Barry. Then finally, on October 20th, they began putting up the iron railing for the Burroughs enclosure, which you see there. On the upper right, there's an enlarged picture of the gravestone for John William Burroughs' son, John William Jr. And I tried to take a close-up of it because I couldn't figure, it's a tiny little obelisk, just so tiny, obviously meant for a very young child, but I couldn't figure out the decoration on the side of the obelisk, and maybe some of you are familiar with that kind of art. But of course, in the diary, the child died in 1864, and I only have the diaries through 1863, but I will read you just a little bit about the birth of Willie. They called him Willie. He was John William Jr., but he was called Willie, and it says clearly Willie on his gravestone. Had to send for the doctor again. This is April 6, 1861. Had to send for the doctor for Molly, that's his wife. He just got here in time to bring the little stranger into the world. And then the next day he says, the little stranger got along very well last night. And then finally, on Wednesday, April 24th, the child is now almost 3 weeks old, Reverend Gordon from St. Thomas Church came to dinner and baptized the baby, now not the stranger, John William. So there's that tiny little obelisk and the burial place of John William Jr. We don't know, there's only one other gravestone in the enclosure, and that is for John William Burroughs' last and ninth child, a daughter, Mary. She did live to adulthood. This is my favorite gravestone inscription, but we have a mystery right now because both I and the chair of the St. Thomas Cemetery Committee cannot find the gravestone. We both know it well because it's everybody's favorite. The front of the stone gives the name of the lady who died 30-some years ago, and on the back was inscribed, "I'd rather be dancing." But the stone is somehow missing, and as soon as I find out what has happened to it, I will let you know. Frank and I are very concerned, and you can't just run off with a stone that easily without leaving some evidence, I would think, but we'll find out. He feels lucky that I was looking for it, so that I have now informed him, the chair of the cemetery committee, that he's missing a gravestone. Next, very close to St. Thomas is St. Simon's Episcopal Mission. Now this was set up, St. Thomas dates from the 1740s and became its own parish in 1855. In 1896, when Reverend Willis was the rector there, he had two maiden sisters who lived with him at St. Thomas, and they began a school for the African American children of the area. And it soon became a desired thing. It's unclear whether it was desired more by the African Americans or by the older white parishioners. They decided to build a mission church for the black families. And that was built at the southern edge of the graveyard in 1896. Not too many years later, I think it was 1902, they actually moved it out of the graveyard, put it on logs and rolled it across the street to some open land across the street, where it was set up again and functioned until 1964 as the Mission Episcopal Church for the black families of the Croom area. And there is a graveyard attached to St. Simon's as well. You have to walk about a half a mile back in the woods, a lovely walk. I thoroughly enjoyed getting back there, to this very small cemetery, which has the remains of about 5 or 6 families, large families, who have been buried there since 1896. The other picture you see is one of St. Simon's Church in the early 20th century. It was demolished in 1970s, early 70s. I have a factoid that you may be interested in. Have most of you seen or at least heard of Green Book? Nobody? Oh, okay. Actually, it was shown here in this theater, and a colleague and I stood up and talked about the actual Green Book after the movie, which was a very interesting session. Well, the last vicar of St. Simon's was the father of Don Shirley, the pianist who is depicted as the main character in the Green Book movie. Yeah, you probably know enough about Don Shirley to know that he was raised in a clergy family. His mother was a musician, his father was the clergyman, and now I've forgotten his first name. I think it was Edwin Shirley. Took over the St. Simon's mission in 1954 and stayed there until the mission was closed for lack of support in 1964. Okay. We're on African American churches, so let's go to Central Avenue, right smack in the center of the county. Ridgely Methodist Church was built, the first church there was built in 1871. This was a farming community of recently freed black folks who set up their own little community, built their church. This church, churches tend to burn, and this church, the one you're looking at, was built in 1921 to replace the original 1871 church. It has a lovely cemetery just adjoining it, and down in the corner I put a picture of the Rosenwald School there because you must know about the Ridgely Rosenwald School. The best restored and great place to visit, restored Rosenwald School, just across the street, a little way down from the church and part of that historic Ridgely community. The stones at the Ridgely Cemetery, part of the church lot, are handcrafted. There are some modern stones, but most of them are handcrafted, as you see here, and quite beautiful. And then we'll go to something that relates to what Ann talked about earlier. This is Abraham Hall that you see on the left, built in 1887 as part of a community called Rossville, and you see the plat for Rossville on the right. 25 acres came out of a plantation owner at the time of his death, came out of his property that needed to be disposed of, and it was purchased and developed into a small farming community of fairly large lots, very close to the Merkart iron furnace, where a lot of these black men worked. There was a church built already, the Queen's Chapel Methodist Church, which you see down in the lower left. Was built in 1868, not this church, but the original church was built in 1868. So when the residential subdivision was built, it sort of joined up with a pre-existing Methodist church. And the largest lot, it's right in the center there, it's lot number 9, was meant for the building of Abraham Hall, which is the Benevolent Society Hall and still exists and is now the headquarters of the Prince George's County Black History Study. And the town, the 25 acres that you see in the plat, came to be known as Rossville because the first buyer of a lot, number 1, the largest residential lot down in the right-hand corner, was Augustus Ross. And here you can see I'm afraid you probably can't even read it, but it does say over there, it does say Augustus Ross and his wife, Sarah Ross. And the extended graveyard, which includes the site of the original church, is a very tranquil, beautiful place. So that is our example of a benevolent society community. Now, not too far from there is the old town of Bowie, the town that grew up at the junction of the Pope's Creek line, which went from Baltimore to southern Maryland, and the line that then went from what became Bowie into the city of Washington. And right beside the tracks on 13th Street, 13th Avenue, a Methodist church was built in 1884. That church is long gone, and this is an example of a small graveyard. There are only maybe a dozen gravestones there, which has just sort of continued to exist in people's backyards. The stones are not within the legal limits of the backyards. They're in the extension between their backyards and the railroad line. But they're looked after by the neighbors, not restored or anything, but sort of looked after and cared about. And the church has been gone since 1924, when they built the new Methodist church a little farther north in the center of town. But the gravestones are still there and being looked after to a certain extent. And now let's look at a couple of other subdivisions where the site of an existing graveyard was known before the subdivision was built. I put a red star on the plat, and I don't believe you can read it. Maybe you can, but it does say either outlot or cemetery or graveyard. And this one is in Mitchellville, very close to Maryland 450, and it is cared for and watched out for by the neighbors on each side of it. And in fact, at my Historical Society library, I got a call recently from a lady who had moved out of the house next door to this cemetery many years ago. She's quite elderly. She lives in Washington, D.C. now. She wanted to know how the cemetery was and whether anybody was taking care of it, as she had done, totally unrelated to the Magruder family that's buried there, but as she had done for many, many years before. And another one, this is quite close to where I live, and this was a forested area with streams and lots of frogs for little boys to play with, and my little boys did. They went across the stream often and played in this area, and they knew that there was a cemetery. And the developers knew it also. You see the red star at the top of this plat where an outlot is created and the houses were built all around it. Now, they made no provisions whatsoever for the care of the cemetery. And some of the neighbors on the other side of the creek were walking over there one time and discovered that the gravestones had been terribly vandalized. And we got together and buried all of the stones except the one that we couldn't move, and then went to the county and asked for help. And the county council assigned a Boy Scouts group to take care of the cemetery, which is all fine except Boy Scouts grow up and the scout leaders forget. So instead of having pulled out the broken stones that we buried 30 years ago, just the one, and you see it there on the right, is standing. The others are all hidden and protected, but not taken care of the way they should be. So this is sort of, I'm not sure what's going to happen in this case. This is the Bowie family, and we'll be talking about the Bowie family shortly. The Bowies they're everywhere in vast numbers. And this is a group of cousins of the Bowies whose cemetery I hope we'll be able to visit in not too long a time today. Oh, then we have war heroes. In this case, Thomas Lancaster Lansdale, who fought in the Revolutionary War, got in trouble with General Washington, but then we see from the correspondence that he did what the general told him and won the forgiveness. He died in 1803 and is buried on the Lansdale family land, which right now has been developed into Bowie's new town center. And that's right, it sort of hangs along the side of Maryland 197, just before it runs into US 301 in Bowie. The stone, the original stone, which you see in the lower left, a friend and I bushwhacked into the area and found this 40 years ago, approximately. Took a picture of it, thank goodness, and then it disappeared. I can't tell you exactly when it disappeared, but it was a long time ago, and it was only, I can't remember what year, I want to think in the 80s or 90s. It was discovered right where it almost should be, and that is at Anderson House Society of the Cincinnati in Washington. Someone had known that Major Lansdale was part of the Society of Cincinnati and had taken it to them, but they didn't know who he was or didn't know what to do with it. It was discovered. I believe it's still there, and a new stone has been created, as you see on the right, and a small park has been developed at the top of this hill. It was the prominent hill in a large plantation of rolling countryside. And it's shielded or sheltered by a black gum tree, a monster black gum tree. It's on the list of champions. When we do our champion tree tour every year, we go there because the tree is a champion. And now we know that the major is still buried there, and he has a new stone and a new sign describing his military career. In Upper Marlboro, we have another hero, and this one I'm sure you've heard of, William Beans, the doctor who lived in Upper Marlboro, who was taken by the British on their ship to Baltimore and was held there captive while his friends, including Francis Scott Key, came and, you know the story. Francis Scott Key watched the results of the battle and wrote the poem which has become our national anthem. Dr. Beans was a doctor. He had served as a surgeon during the Revolutionary War, lived right in town, After he died in 1828, his house became the academy when the first academy was set up in Upper Marlboro in 1835. He died in 1828. His wife, who died a few years before him, is buried there in the enclosure, which was created by the town after the academy had gone on to metamorphose into a high school and then a grade school. The children of the school raised money to take care of the gravestones, and then again that was in 1914 on the centennial of the Battle of Baltimore and the writing of the national anthem. Then again, a local preservation group has removed some of the stumps and taken care of the stones about 1985, I think. And this is a very prominent site in the town of Upper Marlboro, right near the county administration building. Here's an outlier. I'm throwing this in on the chance that some of you do not know about this cemetery. In Suitland, right on the district line. Is it familiar to any of you? It's a public cemetery, and I throw it in because of its sculpture. Dionisio Rodriguez, a famous faux bois sculptor from Mexico, worked at Cedar Hill from 1936 to 38 and created this bench, this marvelous bridge, the Bridge of Life, he called it, all out of reinforced cement made to look like wood, faux bois. And this tree, which is just supposed to be a tree stump, and quite a few other art pieces, definitely worth going to visit this cemetery just for the faux bois sculpture. Dionisio Rodriguez is his name. He died soon after he did this work. Okay, back to ordinary cemeteries. This is one stone. Actually, it's part of a larger family, Townsend and Robinson family cemetery, but it's the only one that I know of that is still surviving, and it has been removed from its place. This photograph was taken when it was just leaning against a tree, and I wish you could read it because the text is fabulous. Let me see if I can read you some of it. John Townsend was controversial, to put it mildly. He wrote the language on the stone, which says, "Sacred to the memory of John Townsend, who was born November 1st, 1765, and died May 14th, 1846, in the 81st year of his age. A man universally esteemed as a good citizen, shrewd in his business transactions, in which, as in everything else, he professed to be governed by his talking mind and personal interviews with the Almighty. He saw him at times with his natural eye, conversed with him face to face as a man with his friend, was impelled by his stern command to do and deterred by his threats from doing, belonged to no church, but professed to be one of God's elect. May he rest in peace." This is what John Townsend wrote to be inscribed on his stone, and it is in beautiful script, which I'm sure is impossible for you to read. Well, that's just the beginning. He owned 70 slaves, and in 2 deeds of manumission, he freed all of them. And that, I just put that up there because it's the beautifully written text of one of his deeds of manumission. And then, in his will, he willed all of his property, considerable amount of property, to these freed slaves. Well, his family didn't take too kindly to that. And the rest of the story goes on for, I think it was 9 years. It went from court to court to court, and was finally settled to the satisfaction of the relatives. No land went to the freed slaves. but there was no money left because of the cost of all the court proceedings. So nobody got anything, but the stone is unique, and I thought you had to see it. This is also unique. At Darnall's Chance, another house museum owned by the Park and Planning Commission, and directly across the street from the County Administration Building in Upper Marlboro. This house has been through many phases. It was built probably in the 1740s, then totally remodeled in 1858 and became an Italianate villa. And then in 1988, since the house was beginning to fall apart, it was decided to return it to its original 1740s configuration. A large part of it is new material, but it makes a wonderful reception place. And we did quite a bit of archaeological work in the grounds around it. And in 1987, I think it was, discovered this underground vault, which has been thoroughly examined carefully, and the remains were sent to Doug Owsley at the Smithsonian. I'm sure you know his name. He identified 9 individuals who were buried inside. One female between 45 and 54, another female, excuse me, that's a male. The woman is a little older, another young woman, a child, a boy, and quite a few small children also. This is probably, well, the ceramics found in association with them date for a large part of the 18th century, from about the 1720s to 1780, when probably the last of the burials took place. Because after the Wardrop Thompson, those 2 families, left the place, the new owners in the 19th century set up their own graveyard, a regular graveyard, not an underground vault. So in June of 2004, after Dr. Owsley had completed his study of the remains, there was a ceremony of reburial. The principal character would be Lettice Lee, who first married a man named Wardrop, James Wardrop. After he died, she married Dr. Adam Thompson. After he died, she married Joseph Sim and moved away to the Sim family's plantation some miles away from Upper Marlboro, and her daughters sold the property. But the folks inside the vault are most likely, I think we may know for sure, members of the Wardrop, and especially the Thompson family. Yes? Oh, okay. Oh, we're almost done, actually. Well, these are controversies, but we won't spend much time on them. This was a piece of land on the Potomac, which was about 25 acres, which was sold for development. I won't go into details. It went back and forth from the Historic Preservation Commission to the status of the property under the preservation ordinance. Finally, the state's attorney did give permission to the developer to move the graves, which were just 5 graves, a father and his 4 children who all died in the 1820s. The next morning, the minute the permission was given, the developer came in with his backhoe and removed everything, and then eventually they were all moved. This was in 2002 to St. John's Episcopal Church in Broad Creek, which is very close to the actual graveyard. And there is a sign now at the site of the original graveyard. which you see on the left. So this was a big controversy. It went on for years, and it didn't even stop then because the neighbors across the street objected to development that would block their view of the Potomac. So the developer planted trees so they couldn't see anything anyway. So then the neighbors poisoned the trees so that they all died. It went on and on. It was an unbelievable story. Those of us who were heavily involved in it at the time just kept thinking, this is fiction. We'll write it up and it'll just go down as fiction. It was amazing. But it ended up with a nice ceremony and the family being buried at St. John's. And also at St. John's, the next controversy just took place very recently with the development of National Harbor. This cemetery was on the site of National Harbor. There you can see the river for a minute. There you can see the plans, which would, I think right here is the location of the cemetery. You can see it's not a great place for a cemetery, especially when it's going to look like that. But again, and this took a long time because there were 50 Addison descendants who were involved in the decision making. And as you know, they have to agree when remains are going to be removed. And it took them a long time hashing out the details, but finally, just last year, the remains there were, I think, 36 recognized individuals, and they were, as you can see on the left, reinterred at St. John's Church. And it has a happy ending. And I have to tell you this because one of my friends, who is an Addison descendant, had faithfully gone to watch the archaeologists to make sure they were doing everything right. She made herself well known to the archaeologists, and they came to love her. And when everything was done, they handed her a brown paper bag, and it was full of about 100, I think she said about 100 tiny, tiny bulbs, which they had rescued from the plantings in the cemetery. Now, they gave them to her because of her faithful attendance, also because she is a master gardener. She has planted them, and this spring they came up, and she discovered that they are bulbs of, it's called Van Scion. It was a development of a daffodil in the Netherlands around 1620. It's a very ancient species. She took it to the big daffodil show, which I didn't even know about, but it's all daffodils, a few weeks ago, and guess who got the blue prize, the blue ribbon? There it is. Woo! Wrong button. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Okay. Anyway, her daffodils from the Addison graveyard won the blue prize. Now, I'm going to jump quickly to the Bowie graveyard, which I hope we get to go visit today. This is what it's going to look like. This is at Fairview, which was the plantation of the Bowie family. The third generation of the family included Governor Odin Bowie, who was governor of Maryland from 1869 to 72. And the one thing I want to tell you, you'll see it, but the one thing I want to tell you about is Anna Holmes, a good friend of mine. She died just a few years ago in her late 80s. She was a member of the Prince George's County Historical Society, served on our board, and her relatives had grown up in the area of Fairview, the Bowie farm, and she had heard the story that her great-great-grandparents, whom you see in the sketch there near Hannah's picture, she had heard from her grandmother that her grandmother's grandparents had worked at Governor Bowie's farm. And she told me this story, and I said, well, you've got to go talk to Odin Bowie. Now, the Odin Bowie II, who was the grandson of the governor, and the second served as Secretary of the Maryland Senate for many, many years, a gruff fellow, but with a heart of gold. I told Anna, you've got to go and talk to him. And she did. She went up to his house. She told him her story. She showed him the sketch and asked if he knew anything about these people, Lizzie and Basil Wood. And he said, of course, I spent my youth in their house. And she was so thrilled. He took her to exactly where they were buried in the Bowie family graveyard, but without a stone. And he asked her if she would like to put a stone there, which you will see this afternoon. Basil was born in 1824. They were enslaved on the Bowie family plantation. His wife, I think 1834, and they lived well into the 20th century. And Odin Bowie, who was born in 1914, used to go to Lizzie's house all the time because she was the cook, and she always had cookies and gingerbread for him. So that was a very happy story of Anna Holmes, who did put up the stone for her great-great-grandparents, and you will see it this afternoon. That is all I have to say. If you have questions, or we can discuss things at lunch. And there are lots of more things for you to see in Prince George's County. I'm so glad you're meeting here. Thank you.